I'm in a situation I can barely comprehend and I need to vent before it consumes me. It all started 5 years ago when our neighbor Robert came to us with the worst news any parent could give. His 14-year-old son Ethan had gone missing. He reported it to the police and the case made headlines on all the local news stations. My wife Sarah and I were devastated for them. We offered our help in any way we could, but there was never a happy ending. As the years passed, with no news of Ethan, it seemed like Robert and his wife Margaret had come to accept the harsh reality. We never had the courage to ask if they ever found the body. In the warmer months, Robert and Margaret still invited us to barbecues in their backyard, but it was impossible to ignore how their son's disappearance had changed them. Margaret, once outgoing and warm, had become a reserved and quiet person, while Robert always seemed anxious and suspicious. Still, we tried not to judge. Who could blame them after something so horrifying? But something changed last week. Something that made all the fear, tension, and mystery surrounding them feel much deeper than I had imagined. Everything seemed normal until last week when Robert appeared at my door while I was taking out the trash. He looked restless, with a sweaty face and a tense expression that made me wonder for a moment if he was okay. Before I could say anything, he asked to borrow a shovel. Without thinking twice, I went inside and grabbed the best one I had. I didn't ask what he needed it for. After all, who doesn't use a shovel from time to time to take care of their yard? He thanked me quickly and went back to his house. When I went upstairs, purely by coincidence, I passed by the window in my bedroom, which offers a clear view of Robert's backyard. That's when I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. He was in the middle of the yard, digging a massive hole in the ground. He looked tired, struggling to finish the task. I decided to be helpful and went over there with my other shovel. As soon as I stepped into the yard and called his name, Robert dropped everything and rushed over to me. He looked frightened, almost desperate, asking me to leave and saying he didn't need any help. His reaction was so out of the ordinary that I felt uncomfortable. When I tried to insist, he pointed to the gate as if trying to force me out. Stunned, I did what he asked and went back home. But something wasn't right. He was acting strangely, like he was hiding something. I went upstairs again to peek through the window. There he was, still digging. This time he looked even more nervous, glancing around as if afraid of being watched. Then our eyes met. Before he could react, I quickly stepped away from the window, trying to act like I hadn't seen anything. But deep down I knew something terrible was happening. That same night, something inside me kept me restless. It was as if the silence itself was screaming, warning me that there was more to this story than I could understand. At 1:30 a.m., I was woken by a muffled sound coming from outside. It was the shovel, hitting the ground. Even though I couldn't see much from the window, I realized Robert was in the yard again. He was digging the same hole with an almost frantic intensity. My curiosity overcame my fear, and I risked sneaking out of the house. Carefully, I reached the fence and peeked over it. The scene was sinister. Under the pale moonlight, I saw Robert digging without stopping. But then something caught my attention. At the bottom of the hole, there was a small piece of black plastic, something that looked like a trash bag partially buried. My heart skipped a beat. What could be inside that bag? When Robert finally went back inside, I seized the opportunity. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was echoing in the silence of the night. I climbed the fence and got closer to the hole, trying to see more clearly what was hidden. There. The black bag gleamed in the moonlight, almost like an invitation for me to discover its contents. I looked at the back door, then at the bag. Something told me I should open it and check, but prudence won out. I decided to return to my yard, and that was a wise decision. Minutes later, Robert came back. But to my surprise, he didn't continue digging. Instead, he disappeared to the other side of the house, as if he were checking something. I took the chance to return to bed, trying not to wake Alice. As I lay down, the muffled sound of the earth being stirred still echoed in my mind. The question that kept me awake was, what was he hiding in that hole? The next morning, the first thing I did was run to the window to look at Robert's backyard. The hole he had spent hours digging the night before was now completely filled in. The soil looked freshly turned, but he had carefully leveled it off. It was as if nothing had happened there. However, the detail that caught my attention, the most, was that Robert's SUV, which always stayed parked in the garage, was now parked on the street. That seemed odd, but I couldn't put the pieces together. I spent the day trying to act normal, but my mind was stuck on what I saw the night before. My wife Alice noticed I was restless, but I didn't have the courage to tell her what was going on. It was like speaking it out loud would make the gravity of the situation even more real. What was at the bottom of that hole? What was Robert trying to hide, or worse, remove? These questions haunted me like an endless echo in my head. Robert's behavior, however, started to alarm me even more. He didn't appear in the yard at all during the day, which was strange considering he usually spent some time taking care of his plants. Later that same day, by coincidence, I looked out the window to his house. That's when I saw him. Robert was standing in one of the windows of his house, staring directly at mine. For a moment, our eyes met, and a chill ran through my body. It was as if he knew that I knew. As soon as he realized I had seen him, he quickly shut the curtains, almost violently. That moment paralyzed me. It was no longer just curiosity or concern, now it was fear. Something was deeply wrong, and Robert's behavior was enough to make me question my own safety. For the first time, I found myself wondering if I should involve the police, but the idea of accusing my neighbor without any concrete proof made me hesitate. Besides, I didn't know how he would react if he found out I was suspicious of him. Despite all these doubts, one thing was clear. I was caught up in something much bigger and more terrifying than I had imagined. Since that unsettling eye contact with Robert through the window, I felt trapped in a web of paranoia. Every noise at night seemed amplified, and every movement in his yard put me on high alert. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, but everything around me seemed to conspire against logic. Robert continued avoiding any interaction. My shovel, which he promised to return the next day, still hadn't come back. Last night, while pretending to read on the couch, I heard something that made me tense up again. The unmistakable sound of a car driving off in a hurry. I rushed to the window, but all I saw was Robert's SUV disappearing around the corner. He left late, well after midnight, and with an unusual speed for someone who usually drove calmly through the neighborhood. This morning, when I looked at his yard again, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A dark, muddy stain where the hole had been patched up. It was as if the earth hadn't settled properly yet, despite his attempt to cover up whatever it was. I couldn't take my eyes off that spot. It was as if it had permanently marked my mind with the mystery and terror that scene carried. Things took an even more disturbing turn when I came back from work this afternoon. As I parked, I noticed Robert standing at the entrance of his house, but he didn't move to greet me or even look at me. He just stood there watching with an indescribable expression. There was something in his gaze that wasn't human, a mix of accusation, desperation, and something that seemed threatening. Now, sitting in my living room, writing these words, I feel a weight on my chest. I don't know what to do. The police? What if I'm wrong? What if it's just my imagination playing tricks on me? But what if it's not? What if I'm right about what I saw that night, about what was at the bottom of that hole? My mind keeps returning to an image I can't erase, the piece of black plastic sticking out of the earth illuminated by the moonlight. Whatever was there, Robert dug it up with intention, with purpose. Now, I find myself facing a choice. Risk my safety and confront him, or continue living with the uncertainty that is slowly consuming me. One thing is certain. I won't be able to ignore this for much longer. Something horrifying happened there, and the more I think about it, the more my fear grows. And Robert, he knows that I know. I can feel it. I've lived in 3 houses throughout my life, always with my family. The first one, where we spent the first 15 years, was where everything began. It was an old house, nestled in the middle of a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by tall trees and empty streets. We got along well with the neighbors, but there was never a close friendship. Everything was calm and routine. However, there was one family next door with two kids who, for some reason, always seemed a little different. There was Jake, who seemed to be the more outgoing of the two, and Luke, the quieter one, who was my age. The fact that we only knew each other on a surface level always gave me a weird feeling. I knew their names, but we were just street acquaintances. Back then, it felt like time passed slowly. The house was big, with a backyard that stretched all the way to the fence and a garage we used to play basketball. One hot afternoon, Jake suddenly appeared outside and came over to us. He walked up, and I wasn't sure what to think when he awkwardly asked if it was true that we were moving. My younger brother, who was only 10 at the time, and I exchanged confused glances. At that moment, I never imagined that this seemingly innocent question would mark the beginning of something much darker. Jake, with his straightforward approach, even suggested that we go on an adventure with him and his brother the next day. They were going to shoot BB guns near the river, in the woods at the end of our street. Since I had nothing else to do, I agreed. My brother insisted on coming too, but since he wasn't invited, Jake said he could join. It sounded like fun, just a boy thing. I had no idea it would lead to something that would haunt me for a long time. The next day, nearly an hour before dusk, we quickly answered the door without our parents knowing we were leaving. Jake and Luke were there, wearing camouflage clothes and carrying heavy backpacks, clearly packed with more than just toys. Their behavior was strange, much more serious than I was used to. Their seriousness, with backpacks full of BB guns, made me laugh, but in an uncomfortable way, as if something was off about the situation. We walked to the woods, but instead of chatting like I expected, silence took over our group. Even my brother and I, who were usually talkative, began to realize that these two weren't like any other kids we knew. When we reached the edge of the river, Jake and Luke started rummaging through their backpacks. Jake pulled out a few guns and, without warning, handed one to us. That's when the atmosphere, which had been casual up until then, shifted. Luke, with a strange smile on his face, said calmly, "These aren't toys." And that was when, for the first time, my body reacted. Something was very wrong, and I couldn't understand what was happening. That moment when Jake handed me the gun felt like a slap to the face. I had never dealt with something so heavy and real before. Up until that point, the idea of going to the woods and playing with BB guns seemed like a great adventure, a typical boys' game. But when he mentioned real guns, something inside me broke. It was a shock, a sense of dread that quickly spread through my body. I looked at my brother, and he looked as confused as I felt. He was younger and surely didn't grasp the severity of the situation. What was meant to be fun was now something much more dangerous. Jake noticed our reaction and gave a short laugh, almost as if he was mocking us. "We always play with them. You're not scared, are you?" he said, challenging our courage. But inside, all I felt was growing fear and the sense that something was deeply wrong with all of this. I grabbed the gun from my brother's hands and, without thinking much, put both of them back in the backpack. "We're not comfortable with this, Jake. We're leaving," I said, trying to stay calm. But as I spoke, I noticed the change in his gaze. It was as if anger was burning beneath the surface, anger that seemed completely disproportionate to the situation. He stopped shooting at the trees and, in a slow and unsettling movement, turned to face us. Luke, who had been farther away, also approached. The tension in the air was palpable. There were no more laughs, no more fun, only a silence filled with something dark. "Then go," Jake said in a cold voice. But the way he looked at us made me understand he didn't like being challenged. Before my brother and I could turn around and head back, Jake yelled something low but aggressive. "Stay away from us, you cowards." I didn't know if he was just angry or if there was something more in that look, something that made me feel like we were dealing with kids far crueler than we could ever imagine. I knew we needed to get out of there as quickly as possible, but the discomfort only grew when I saw them turning to watch us as we started walking back. Their eyes followed every movement, as if they were waiting for us to do something else, something they could use against us. That night when I got home, I didn't say anything to my parents. I didn't mention the gun or what had happened. To them, Jake and Luke were just two weird kids from next door, and for me, that night they were just that. Or at least that's what I wanted to believe. I woke up in the middle of the night to a cold wind blowing against my face. The breeze, gentle but cold, seemed strangely present, as if it were trying to wake me up. Something was wrong. My eyes adjusted to the darkness and I realized that my bedroom window was wide open. That didn't make sense. I always closed the windows before going to sleep. The feeling of dread began to crawl up my spine like a cold wave, and at that moment fear turned into something more real, more threatening. I slowly turned to look at the window, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I felt something hard pressing against the back of my head. It was a strange sensation, a pressure, and then a low, hissing voice froze me in place. Shh. I couldn't move. The sound of the voice seemed to come from somewhere I couldn't see, from someone who was very close but wasn't visible. What I felt wasn't just fear. It was a sense of total helplessness. Something was wrong and I knew there was no way to escape it. The voice, now clearer, whispered again, and when I recognized it, my heart raced. It was Jake's voice. He was there, behind me, and I didn't know how he had gotten in. The pressure against my head increased and I felt a cold sensation spreading through my body. He wasn't playing anymore. I had already realized that these boys were different, but what he said next was the last straw. If you tell anyone, especially my dad, I'll come back, and it'll be the last time you see your family. I trembled. The threat was like a blade cutting through the air. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that he was in my house or the psychological terror he was trying to impose on me. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but my body was frozen with fear. Okay, was all I could reply, my voice shaky. He pressed the gun against my head, as if reminding me of the fragility of my life, my family. I wouldn't dare do anything to upset him because, in a way, he was telling me that he could do something much worse than any normal kid would be capable of. I didn't understand the gravity of the situation, but I felt the threat pulsing in those words, and I couldn't ignore them. He quickly backed off and without a sound disappeared through the window. However, what remained wasn't just the emptiness of that night. It was the terror that settled inside me. The terror of knowing that somewhere in the house next door, there was a presence watching. Jake and Luke, those boys who had seemed so innocent, had now become my worst nightmares. For months, every night I'd wake up and see Jake's face watching me through the window, staring. His presence was as constant as the darkness that filled my room. I knew he was there. I didn't need to see anything else to know he was watching every step I took. It was an unbearable feeling, a paranoia that wouldn't let me be at peace. The worst happened the week before we moved. That night, around 1 a.m., I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the echoes of a presence that seemed to follow me. I couldn't sleep like I used to. I was already used to feeling that fixed stare watching me through the window, that constant feeling of being watched, of someone always being there, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. But that night, fear took on a new form. A stone hit my window, breaking the silence of the night. The sound was so sudden and deafening that my body froze. My heart raced and I didn't know whether to run to the hallway or just hide under the covers, as if that would protect me from something so real. I knew what it meant. Jake and Luke were there doing what they did best, terrorizing. I quickly got up, my feet cold against the floor, and went to the window. When I opened it, what I saw made my blood run cold. Jake was standing there with a gun pointed directly at the window. I could see his pale face illuminated by the streetlight, but his eyes were cold and indifferent, as if he were on a mission. He wasn't playing anymore, and this time there was no way to pretend we were still just kids. Two weeks ago, my life took an unexpected turn. After finishing college, I didn't have many options except to look for a cheap place to live. I ended up finding a house in a really bad neighborhood where the only thing that stood out were the neighbors. It was the only place I could afford, so I had to accept the price of living in such a dangerous area. The problem was, even though I was living alone, I wasn't exactly isolated. On one side, I had neighbors who didn't know what silence was. They played music at full volume all the time, which drove me crazy. But it's the house on the other side where things really get weird. Next door, there are two women. The older one, named Margaret, is around 60 years old and doesn't seem to be the friendliest person. She has a strange look in her eyes, like she's always lost in her own thoughts, and whenever I find myself near their house, there's this tension in the air that I can't explain. The other one, a young woman named Emily, is probably in her 30s, but she seems to have some kind of severe mental disability. I never quite figured out what happened to her, but her behavior is strange and unsettling. I could never understand the relationship between the two, but what scares me the most is what happens in their house. Whenever I'm sitting on my porch, I can see Margaret holding Emily, who seems to be having some sort of breakdown. She rocks back and forth, shouting and making unintelligible sounds. And the worst part is sometimes Emily looks directly at me, pointing and whispering something to Margaret. It's an unsettling feeling, almost as if they know I'm watching them, like they're daring me to do something. But every time this happens, I try not to get involved. I just want to keep my head down and ignore it. But it's getting harder and harder to block it out. It was an ordinary night, or at least it should have been. I was trying to rest for work the next day, but as usual, my neighbors couldn't understand what silence was. The music on the left side was blaring, but what was really bothering me was the noise coming from next door, the sound of Emily screaming. She was once again in a breakdown, and her voice echoed through the wall, interrupting any chance of rest. I couldn't ignore it anymore. What bothered me even more was the sound of Margaret, the older woman, shouting, trying to calm Emily down, but her voice, full of desperation, only amplified the chaos. It lasted for at least an hour, and with every passing minute my discomfort only grew. Emily was completely out of control, screaming in a way that almost seemed supernatural. I had never heard anything so distressing before. I was completely frustrated. I tried to block out the noise, put a pillow over my head, but nothing helped. I just wanted silence. I wanted the situation to stop, but the sound of the screaming seemed to suffocate me. I couldn't take it anymore. I don't know what came over me in that moment, but suddenly I found myself walking out of the house, marching up to the door next door. I knocked loudly, the sound echoing in the cold night. When the door opened, Margaret glared at me with a fiery look. "What the hell are you doing here?" she said in a hoarse, aggressive voice. I tried to stay calm and polite, explaining that the noise was unbearable and asking them to turn it down. She raised an eyebrow, clearly irritated by my request. Before I could say anything else, Emily appeared behind Margaret, screaming even more frantically. "How dare you?" she kept repeating as she moved closer to me. Panic began to take over, but Margaret held her back, stopping her from coming any closer. Then with a swift motion, she slammed the door in my face. I stood there not knowing what to do. It was stranger than anything I'd ever experienced. I had no idea what was going on, but it was clear that I no longer had control of the situation. I went back to my house feeling a mix of anger and confusion. When I finally entered, I could hear the silence, which felt even stranger than the chaos. I thought maybe I'd finally be able to sleep, but something told me that the night still had more surprises in store. I returned to my house feeling exhausted but also strangely relieved. After all that noise, it seemed like the house next door had finally gone quiet. I knew it wasn't healthy to keep thinking about it, but something told me not to just ignore it. Still, I tried to convince myself that nothing else would happen. Things finally seemed to have calmed down. This made me believe I could sleep. I threw myself into bed trying to relax, but when I looked at the clock, I saw it was only 3 a.m. A strange feeling ran through me, as if the night was still watching me. But before I could get lost in thought, something interrupted what should have been my well-deserved rest. I heard something coming from downstairs, a faint sound almost imperceptible. I stayed still, trying to figure out what it was. I tried to convince myself it was just the house making noises, something natural. But the sound persisted, some kind of muffled whisper followed by the noise of soft footsteps, almost as if someone was walking around the house. My body froze. I looked at my clock, but the silence enveloped me again. Nothing for a few seconds. Was almost about to fall back asleep, trying not to worry, when I was suddenly awakened again, this time more intensely. I looked around the room, now completely dark, and started searching for any sign that I wasn't alone. I didn't want to believe what was happening. I tried to grab my phone, hoping to use the light to see better, but hesitated. Something told me not to turn on that light. It was as if by doing so, I'd summoned something. The feeling of dread grew stronger with every passing second. I felt the pressure in my chest, like someone was near me. When I finally managed to turn on my phone's flashlight, I looked around, desperately searching for a logical explanation for what was happening, but there was no explanation. I looked toward the corner of my room, and that's when I saw it. A dark spot, a black shape, rounded, right at the edge of my bed. I didn't know what I was seeing, but as I moved the light closer, the vision that revealed itself made my blood run cold. What I saw was Emily's face, the young woman from next door, her wide eyes fixed on me. She was there, at the edge of my bed, her expression twisted in a silent scream. Her mouth was open, and the sound that came from it wasn't human. It sounded like something more primal, like the scream of a mad creature. I screamed, a cry that came out of me before I could control it. I tried to back away, but I was paralyzed with fear. Before I could run, Emily moved quickly, her eyes never leaving mine. She screamed, but the sound was grotesque, like a vampire, thirsty for blood. In a panic, I stumbled and ran to the door of my room, not daring to look back. The sensation of being followed was overwhelming. I finally managed to lock the door behind me, but the sound of her screams continued to torment me. She was out there, just outside. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. My heart was racing, panic taking over. I was in shock, unable to process everything that was happening. Emily, the disturbed young woman from next door, had invaded my room in such a terrifying way. I could barely comprehend the severity of the situation. I didn't know if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I heard the muffled sounds of her screams echoing through the house, I knew I couldn't just stay there and wait. Without wasting time, I called the police, barely able to get the words out, my voice trembling, my fingers sweaty as I held the phone. I had no idea what else to do, but I knew I needed help. I wasn't prepared for what would come next in this terrifying night. The sound of violent banging on the door made me even more paranoid. Emily was still out there, banging, screaming, incomprehensible words like some kind of possessed creature. When I finally heard the sirens of the police, I let out a sigh of relief. I knew someone needed to deal with this. When the officers arrived, I went to the door and explained everything that had happened. My voice was shaky, but I told them the truth. How Emily and her mother, Claire, had behaved in such a terrifying way. How the young woman's screams seemed to come from something beyond human, and how Claire appeared to have no control over her. They listened intently, but didn't seem surprised. It was as if they were already used to something similar. That's when Claire appeared suddenly at the door with a terrifying look. She was visibly shaken, but something in her eyes, something in that look, was pure hatred. She looked at me, and in that moment I realized that she knew. She knew exactly what I had just done. And worse, she hated me for it. She pleaded with the officers in a soft but insidious voice, asking them to leave her daughter alone. A chill took over my body, and I couldn't understand how she could be so indifferent to the situation. The officers insisted on arresting Emily, at least for that night. It was the only solution they saw. But I couldn't forget the look on Claire's face. That dark expression of vengeance, the promise of something far worse to come. As they escorted Emily away, she glanced back at me, her eyes filled with malice, as if telling me, "You've made a grave mistake." The nightmare had only just begun.